Good. And in a beautiful spring color, I must say. Good, good. Well, you know, I'm assuming that people know by this point that I'm going to come and annoy you. So there you are. Thank you. I don't know where my husband disappeared. Where is your wife? Where's your wife? Do you not come with somebody else usually? Oh, okay, all right, okay. One never knows.
Folks, let's gather. Folks, let's gather so we can start.
I do. I know exactly what you mean. Ah,
This is God and
animals. We're going to be talking about animals today, the animal world, yes.
Welcome. Thank you for being patient on the movement of chairs and new members being here first. So it is great, and we welcome Rabbi Barbara, who's going to talk about God and the animals in Hebrew Scripture.
Yes, and no, I'm going to be transparent about this. Pam nicely pointed out to me that sometimes I'm referring to biblical stories and you don't know necessarily who I'm talking about. So I'm going to say, let's be really transparent, like I say with my students all the time, which is, if I'm speaking about a story or a narrative or a text you don't recognize, what would be the thing to do? Yes. And say, Rabbi Barbara, I have no memory of that. Can you explain? Because, you know, honestly, I don't know what's in your heads and what needs to be in your heads to contextualize what I'm saying. So please feel free to interrupt me. And also feel free to interrupt me. I mean, did you hear me? Feel free to interrupt me. I say this to my students all the time, right? I get in front of them and I'm going, and it's, you know, a million miles an hour, and they think they can't stop me, and they can. And 9 times out of 10, when my students stop me, they are stopping me for the same reason that half the other students wish they would. So if you raise your hand, it is almost certain that someone else in this room needed for you to do it because they were feeling too shy to do it themselves. So feel free to do that, okay? So we're going to talk today with the trajectory here was the first day I wanted to talk to you about Bible in a theoretical way, in a way that asked us, how is it that we create and recreate biblical literature in every generation? And why that's important that we do that we grapple with it, that we ask, what does it mean for us and our time? Because if it's not meant to mean anything, then let's put it aside and, you know, we don't have to worry about it anymore. But obviously, it is meant to mean something because we have kept it. We could have decided not to keep it, right? Go back to the time of Marcionites, and you'll find that there was a whole constituency that was particularly interested, especially in the Christian world. The Marcionites were interested in just saying, we don't need the Hebrew Bible, what you all sometimes call the Old Testament, even though it's not exactly the same thing. We don't need that. And most of Christianity said, yes, we actually do. So since you decided, or your ancestor decided that you need it, let's hold on to it and see what it has to tell us. Oh, interesting. We lost a picture. And James is going 1 second, which means we have to do a little bit of a tap dance. While James comes up and does his tap dance. This is the tech tap dance. Right? All right. Did we? Oh, interesting. Okay. Well, we're just going to stand here and do this kind of thing. Like maybe if I do it too, maybe. Right. Yeah. Yes, but let's do this in a careful way. Okay? Let's be careful how we do this. All right, James, I will just keep on talking to you a little bit about the trajectory of the course, and we'll give James a few minutes to do this, because what we're going to be doing today is talking about more generally the question of what I would call non-human animals, because actually human beings are also animals, right? So non-human animals will be the topic of today's conversation, and then we're going to get into something really fascinating in the third week, because as you know, I like to leave you at the end of every 3-week session with going, what the heck was that? So the third week we'll be talking about the Leviathan and the Behemoth and their relationship to the Israelite deity, to the deity of Bible. So let's start, while we're figuring this out a little bit, just by asking questions. What do you know about non-human animals in what you will call the Old Testament and I will call the Hebrew Bible? What do you know while we're waiting for this to maybe reappear magically?
Well, one of the most famous is a snake.
The serpent, right? The Nachash, yes, who is incredibly clever, right? Or nude. Yeah, you're looking at me like, what? Well, because the serpent is described as arum, and arum means either shrewd or nude. And a great wordplay goes on through that story. Some of you have heard me talk about that, the Genesis story with Adam and Eve, because Adam and Eve are described as arumim, which is the plural. Are they nude or are they shrewd? This wordplay goes on constantly through the entire chapter. You never know whether we're talking about, once they reach for the fruit and eat it, are they being described as naked, as nude, or are they being described as smart? They just ate from the fruit of knowledge of good and bad, right? So it could be either one. So yeah, you think you know about the serpent? It's a sneakier story than you knew when you read it in the Hebrew. Yeah, but famous character, and one of only 2 talking non-human animals in the Hebrew Bible. Does anybody know who the other one is? Say, oh, okay. Yes. And there's there's another sneaky thing about that donkey. Do we know specifically whether that donkey is male or female? We do. The donkey is female. So when she's being beaten by Balaam, remember that he beats her 3 times? Remember that? So the story is that he's being hired to go curse the Israelites, and he has nighttime negotiations with the Israelite deity, who first tells him, don't go, and then he gets offered more money, and he goes back to God and says, and God says, well, okay, you can go, but only if you do what I tell you. It's a very confusing story. And then he goes, and then God is really annoyed about it, after saying no, then yes, very confusing, puts a Satan, a Satan, in his way, in the form of an angel with flaming swords. Satan does not mean devil. There is no such thing. Satan means an obstacle or an adversary in your way. The angel, God's angel, is an adversary and basically says, danger, Will Robinson, don't go forward. The donkey tries to avoid the angel because the donkey sees it, and Balaam doesn't. The seer doesn't see, but the donkey does. Balaam beats the donkey 3 times. And if you read this in Hebrew, what you will hear is a different story, because what will happen is you'll hear her saying, and she said, why have you beaten me these 3 times? I've only ever have I done anything to deserve this? Have I ever done anything to deserve this? Can you hear the voice of women who for centuries have said, why are you beating me? Did I do anything to deserve this? Right? Things you don't know about these stories that unpack themselves when you read Hebrew. Amazing, right? Amazing. Okay, so those are the only 2 talking animals, non-human animals in the Hebrew Bible, and both of them tell the truth. I mean, the serpent tells the truth. God's a little anxious about you doing and finding out about things that you shouldn't find out about. And then God in Genesis 3:22 runs around saying, oh no, they've eaten from this tree. What if they eat from that tree, right? God is worried about it. So the serpent tells the truth. Also says, God knows you're not going to die. That's not going to be the problem. So that animal tells the truth. Balaam tells the truth. Balaam's donkey tells the truth. There we are. Animals can tell the truth. I'm having a feeling that if we wait for this PowerPoint to show up, it might not ever, and I should just start without it, and so you're not going to see the pretty pictures. Yes? Okay. All right. Well, that's too bad, and perhaps what we can do is make that PowerPoint available in some way, right, at some point. So the first picture, it's just, I guess I could show you this way. Right? I didn't print this out in color. I didn't think I needed to. And I want to read you a quote from one of my very, very, very favorite scholars of all time, Darren Guest. We're going to talk about her work next week, too. She wrote, "We have an ethical responsibility to challenge collusion with texts that diminish the lives of people." I'm going to do that again. We have an ethical responsibility to challenge collusion with texts that diminish the lives of people. And you are asking, what does that mean? People, I have been writing about this now for years and years and years. The third book is full of this principle. The fourth book, the fifth book, and the sixth book are all going to be filled with this principle. We cannot collude with texts that have been used to harm or that can be used to harm. These are things we have to name. So I want you to remember the principle behind everything I will always do here, which is we cannot collude with texts that do harm. We have to name them, identify them, and see what we can do to transform ourselves and the world. So, starting with that, you remember my telling you Bible is a kind of performance. I'm going to read you a quote from another one of my favorite scholars, Ken Stone. "As in the case about debates around Bible's views on gender and sexuality, so also in the relationships among humans, animals, and God, the biblical creation accounts are complex and contradictory enough so that people can get to lots of different interpretations through them by emphasizing some textual elements over others." Right? We can emphasize the serpent as some kind of horrible, dangerous figure, or we can emphasize the serpent as a truth teller, and a humorous one at that, right? Depends on how you're reading that text. Our interpretation of all of these texts, whether they're about sexuality, gender, or non-human animals, are performative accounts. They generate different versions of, quote unquote, what the Bible says about animals. So I'm going to try to give you some different versions about what Bible says about animals. What is the first thing that we hear about the human animal and the non-human animal relationship in the very beginning in Genesis 1? God says something to the created human animal about how and what his relationship is to animal life. Anybody remember that? Yes, has dominion over them. That line has been taken as the bedrock of what Hebrew Bible says about the relationship between humans, I'm going to make it simpler for us, humans and animal life, right, for centuries. And it has been used for that many centuries to justify moving animals, killing animals, eating animals, destroying animal habitats. It's been used for centuries. We have the right. We have the power. It's God-given, right in this opening set of lines. And I want to ask you, can that view be troubled, as we say in scholarly worlds? Can we trouble that view? And the answer is absolutely it can. Now, it partially can because, oh my gosh, let me think back 4 decades to a professor I had, Dr. Konrad Jahausch. He was German. Boy, was he German. I liked annoying him. And he put up with it pretty well. But I remember him saying, and this was at the time, folks, when my field of study was German history, 20th century. I remember him saying in a lecture at one point or another, the Bible is like an encyclopedia or like a dictionary. It's filled with everything. It's got everything. Whatever you want to find in there, you can find. And to some extent, 4 decades later, I'd say, yep, you can do it. You absolutely can. One of the things that we find in the Hebrew Bible is that two times, the deity does something like a woman, cries out like a woman in labor when he's in profound and serious distress, is one of the examples. Now, does that mean that the deity is a woman? Answer? No. At no point is the deity ever described as a woman, I am sorry to say. Because, like many other feminist scholars, I hunted for evidence. I read Phyllis Tribble. I tried to believe her. And it turned out, no, it doesn't work out that way. But weirdly enough, God is not only frequently described as doing something like an animal, God is also described, are you ready for this, as an animal. So while God is never described as a woman, as female, God is described as an animal. Do you have any idea what animal this deity is most associated with? Just take a guess. If you, pardon me? A hen? Pam, did I hear you right? Did you say a hen? God, as far as I know, is never described. I mean, chickens aren't really, to begin with, chickens are not native animals to ancient. They were brought from India. It took a while. Yes, but not in Bible. I mean, okay, somebody else said, like a, yes, absolutely, 10 genius points to the woman over there. I give my students genius points now and again. So there you go, you got 10 genius points. Like a lion. God is more often described as being like a lion than in any other kind of animal. So I'm going to read you 2 quotes. Sometimes God acts like a lion, listen carefully to this word, protecting Israel. Quote from Hosea, chapter 11, "They shall go after the Lord. He will roar like a lion. When he roars, his children will come trembling from the west." He's protecting Israel in this passage. But Hosea 13, God can act like a lion attacking Israel when they've done wrong. So it can both be protecting and can be attacking. "So I will be like a lion to them, like a leopard I will lurk by the path, like a bear robbed of her cubs, I will attack them and rip them open. Like a lion I will devour them, a wild animal will tear them apart." Pretty violent language. It's all in your position. If you go to the gates of ancient cities, sometimes you will find, among other things, lion statues there. Okay, so have any of you ever been there or seen what I'm talking about? So I'm going to make you a lion, and I'm going to make you a lion, and if I am here going into the city, you are pretty scary to look at. Right? Oh, she even roared at me. Maybe we shouldn't do the PowerPoint. This is much more fun. But if I am behind them, what is their role? They're protecting me, right? So you can have a lion doing both things, and both will actually work. So one thing we should ask ourselves about biblical texts, and now I would say this is true not only of Hebrew Bible, but the New Testament. We should ask whether the textual subordination of women ever seems to be connected to the textual subordination of animals. Because in both sets of texts, these are groups that are often subordinated to a male perspective, male control, and male dominion, right? Woman shall be silent in church, right? Animals are there in order to be sacrificed to God. We could go on and on, right? So the Hebrew Bible repeatedly describes the deity as a shepherd, which of course makes the Israelites into animals, right? Right? Who said sheep? Yeah, the Israelites become sheep, they become goats in that world. So you can see how the boundaries and the borders between the human animal and the non-human animal are somewhat porous. People change positions, so does God. Sometimes God is an animal, is a lion, either an attacking one or a protecting one. Sometimes the Israelites are sheep and goats themselves. Bible characters are often named after animals. Do any of you know any Bible characters named after animals? Yeah.
Tabitha mean gazelle, maybe?
Say again?
Does Tabitha mean gazelle, maybe? I've had several students who knew the animal their Hebrew name came from. And I'm trying to remember who.
I'd have to see the Hebrew for that. Sometimes when we anglicize a name, I'm going like, possible, okay. Other suggestions, thoughts? Oh, I'll tell you, there's a lot of weird and interesting punning that goes on here. So for example, Caleb, the spy Caleb, a Caleb is a dog, right? And if you look at the story, does anybody remember the story? I'm listening to what Pam's telling me. In 1 Samuel 25, when David goes to a rich sheep herder by the name of Nabal and says, we've been protecting you, therefore now that you are in the midst of a festival where you're celebrating, give my men food, right? Because we've been kind of guerrilla folks out here protecting you from Saul's troops, right? Well, Naval's name means fool, and he is a Calebite. He belongs to the dogs. And the story includes David making a really crude reference to, quote unquote, pissing against the wall like a dog. Amazing, right? All these kinds of associations. Rachel's name.
Leah and Rachel.
Yeah, Rachel means ewe, a ewe lamb, E-W-E. Yael's name, I think I mentioned to you last week from Judges, can either mean he goes up, or it can also mean mountain goat. Goliath's name might come, according to Richard Woodard, from an ancient source, Akkadian source that means lion. And if so, there's a really interesting set of things going on, because you remember how David boasts, I was out in the fields, and when lions and bears came after my sheep, right, I would grab them by the beard, and God would help me vanquish them. And David is once again going to be vanquishing a kind of monstrous being who is like a lion. Interesting, right? And if you want to know the interesting sexual aspects to David grasping animals by the beard, ask me after class. Or is there anybody who really wants to know now? Okay. Now, you're all such nice people. Pardon me? I think we got it. Do you? What is it? What are you speculating in your very creative and interesting mind? Notice she's doing this. What's the beard? Yes, all right then. Good for you. You know, the left side of this room is on. Absolutely it is. It's referred to in especially rabbinic texts, the beard as pubic hair. Absolutely. So I mentioned that God can be as like an animal. Well, God, well, heavens to Betsy. Thank you, James. That's really good because the second half of the PowerPoint has some very pretty pictures. All right, so we can move to the next slide, actually, but I will do that. Amazing, he even got us to the right slide. Isn't that, like, can we just, hold on a minute. Oh, I'm telling you, those techies. What will we do without them in this world? Unless they're working for Elon Musk. In which case, they're very dangerous. Don't let them in your house, and don't give them your social security information. I know. So the Israelite deity is repeatedly named a bull. He's a bull. And if you know anything about Canaanite mythology, the god El, right, is also a bull god. And this deity, whose personal name is Yud-He-Vav-He, right, or the Tetragrammaton, is, however, once upon a time a subordinate in the pantheon of El, and Hebrew Bible does a lot of work to make Yud-He-Vav-He and El the same. That's why we have Elohim as another title for God, and often we even have Adonai and Elohim put together, Adonai being the way Jews pronounce the Yud-He-Vav-He, because we're not supposed to pronounce that particular name. It gets complicated, I'm sorry, people. That's a whole nother class. But the point is that all this bull imagery is so amazing. You find in ancient depictions of ancient deities all the time. They're wearing horned hats, right? This bull imagery is all over the place. Remember the horned altars, right? And the bulls at the sanctuary of Dan might jog a little bit of a memory. So they're around. And I love the way that people translate it. The mighty one of Israel, of Jacob. Ha, interesting translation. The word used there is bull. God is a bull. Your translators don't want to do that. They're awkward in this moment. They go, oh no, I can't really describe God as a bull. But that's God's name too. And in Numbers 23 and 24, God is described as having the horns of a wild ox. We might remember that when Moses comes down from Sinai, right, he has keren. Keren are either beams of light or they are horns. This was the reason that Jews were depicted for the next 2,000 years often as having horns on their head. And I am not joking when I say that when I first came down to the South, I was asked once whether I had horns. I know. It's real. Strange things happen in the world. Is Yud-He-Vav-He ever a non-human animal? Yeah, absolutely. I mentioned earlier in Lamentations. Remember, I don't know if you remember, some years back, we did some work on Lamentations, and it's a text, an underlooked at text, particularly in Christian circles. And in chapter 3, the Gever, the strong man, says God is a lurking bear, right? God is a lion in hiding. God has attacked me, brutalized me, harmed me. It's a very disturbing text, and then goes through his deep difficulty with how he can resolve his love and his hope for a God that has done him so much harm. Chapter 3 in Lamentations. And, you know, we often see animals being used to bestialize. Remember when I said we should look at how women are treated in concert with how animals are treated? Right? And here, animals are being used in order to bestialize other human beings. So we have Ishmael described as a wild ass of a man. Remember that text? That text might be more familiar to you. Genesis, people often, how many people have read Genesis? Right? You might even have gotten through parts of Exodus. It's when you hit Leviticus that you said, nope, I'm done. Right? Yeah. An ancestor of a non-Israelite clan is given the name Hamor, and this is the masculine, right? As opposed to Aton, which is the feminine for donkey. So an ancestor is named a donkey. Egyptians and their gods are associated with the genitals of donkeys and the emissions of stallions. It's a very crude, awful text. 23 is actually one of the most violent texts in all of Hebrew Bible, largely featuring absolutely horrific violence against Israel personified as female by God. And the men of Jerusalem, when they're being disloyal to God, are described as well-fed, lusting stallions, each neighing for the wife of his neighbor. Pretty crude language, right? Are any of you noticing that the crudity of this language is the kind of crudity of language we have seen in our political discourse in the last decade? Really crude language, including about people's bodies, right? Something's going on in that room. Sometimes the comparisons are quite positive, right? David compares Saul and Jonathan to swifter than eagles and stronger than lions, which is really quite a beautiful idea, right? Make it visible for yourselves, and now you see that the human being is associated as having speed, of having flight, right? Things that would look beautiful to any of us. Watch a lion run. It is one of the most beautiful things ever to see, right? Watch an eagle fly. God as an animal can also be something beautiful as well as something dangerous. This is one of my absolute favorite texts in all of Hebrew Bible. There's a beautiful song written by Rabbi Jack Gabriel, to this text. I should have brought in my guitar and played it for you. It's really lovely. Well, maybe we'll do that next week. And it's God saying, I lifted you up, I carried you on my wings. When Ethiopian Jews were saved, they thought of the plains as this kind of text. They thought about their rescue in terms of this text. The idea that the deity has that kind of protective, nurturing, freeing power, it's beautiful, isn't it? Don't we wish that we could ride on the wings of the divine right now at this moment in time? I think probably all of us could use that lift. So as Ken writes, and by the way, he wrote a book on reading the Hebrew Bible with animal studies, on which some of this PowerPoint is resting. If you have time and interest, it's a beautiful book. It will lift you up in ways that you might need. Written as it was prior to modern humanism, biblical literature fails to provide us with a clear picture of a unified human subject, right, that can be easily distinguished from the animal as such. There may not be a single view. There may not be any single view. Is there a spiritual message? Oh, this might be one. Praise Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh from the earth, you great sea creatures, and all ocean depths, lightning and hail, snow and clouds, stormy winds that do his bidding, you mountains and all hills, fruit trees and all cedars, wild animals and all cattle, small creatures and flying birds. Can you feel the world teeming with life? Teeming with life? The story is not just about our dominion. The story is about that teeming of life praising God for its existence, in which case our dominion should be restricted so that that can never not happen. Remember this quote at the beginning? What's the difference? I wrote it differently here. What was the last word when I read it to you? Does anyone remember? I read, we have an ethical responsibility to challenge collusion with texts that diminish the lives of people. I'm going to have to write Darren this week and say, listen, just so you know, I put up your quote and I changed a word. We have an ethical responsibility to challenge collusion with texts that diminish the lives of animals. My friends, we are living in a world where 20 to 50% of the bird populations in our world have been dropping, right, by 20 to 50%, depending on where you are, because of the habitat erosion, light pollution, all sorts of things. I don't know how any of you feel about birds, but they're a pretty sympathetic animal, and we need them. We need them. We are living in a world in which the erosion of habitat and the threat to non-human animal life is part of the tragedy of global warming. Those are real issues. And ultimately, as much as last week I was pointing out our need to defend our democracy, I will also say that if we don't defend our climate and our planet, the other piece will matter. So we need to think about all of those things, and we need to think about them in relationship to what we call faith, and what we call commitment to faith, and what we call commitment to community, and what you call commitment to Christianity, and what I call commitment to Judaism. Because if we are possessed of a deity who can sometimes take the form of a non-human animal, as well as a human animal, then there's a message in that. And that message is that God is intimately related to all of creation and all of its shapes and forms. And therefore, all of its shapes and forms deserve protection and care. And with that, I will say thank you. Thanks again to James for working all that time so that we eventually got the pretty pictures too.
Are you ready for questions?
I am ready for questions.
Well,
And it can be comments and suggestions, and if people want to go back to beards and pubic hair, that's fine too.
I see
Whatever.
all over that. That's great. Oh. No, it's great.
I'll just throw this out. I've always been interested, well, not, anyway. The part of Genesis where there's a reference to the peaceable kingdom, everything, humans and animals eat plants, and then after the fall, started eating meat. I'm just curious what you think about that particular passage of Scripture.
So there are several places in Scripture where we have a vision of, animals lying down with the lamb and having some kind of idyllic, peaceful space. This comes up in psalm texts. This comes up in narrative text. It even comes up in prophetic texts. I think these are the texts that require more than lip service. And I think that what they've mostly gotten has been lip service. Oh, this is very pleasant and we can mention it in a sermon. But actually creating that world, making that happen, is our ethical responsibility, right? It's not going to happen without us. And it certainly is not going to happen if we don't think it's important. So I would say those texts require a whole lot more commitment and clarity and less putting them on the wall in a pretty frame. This is work we have before us to create that world. And even if we never see it or achieve it, what is your task while you are here? I mean, Martin Luther actually riffed on a line in Talmud, which is, if I knew the Messiah was coming and I was busy planting a tree, do I stop planting the tree to go greet the Messiah? That's in Talmud. And the answer is no, you finish planting the tree. Martin Luther said the same thing, riffed on it, said exactly the same. So both our traditions are saying, what is it that you need to do for tikkun, for help, for action, to make the world that the texts are revealing to you is of critical importance to God? That would be my answer to that one.
I saw a few other hands, but that was one.
Do you all know each other? Because if you don't, you should be giving your names, just in case there are people who are new.
Okay. Jonah and the Whale.
Your name.
Eric. Jonah.
Short memory.
Yes. Jonah and the Whale. And
Jonah and the Whale.
Daniel
It's
and
not
the
a whale, though, it's a fish.
fish.
A
Okay.
large fish. but a
Okay,
fish.
well,
Yeah.
okay. And Daniel and the lion's den. Is this God's creatures interfering in his purpose, correct?
Sometimes, absolutely. God uses, I have a student, a graduate student, who spent the entire semester working on all the categories of where non-human animals show up in Hebrew Bible. And there's a whole category on animals that God uses as a messenger. You could make the claim that the bears who show up when Elisha is called Baldy by some 42 kids, right? And Elisha curses them, and bears show up and maul those children. You could claim that God is sending those animals to show those kids who's boss. That's my prophet, don't call him Baldy, because being without hair is kind of a problem in a masculine sort of setup world. So, yeah, it's something to worry about in biblical text. Do we always have a million moments of what seems paradoxical in all of our biblical literature, where there is one statement and then another statement which seems to directly contradict that statement? We absolutely do, but keeping in mind that at least Hebrew Bible is written over a period of probably 7 to 10 centuries by multiple authors and then edited and re-edited, it's kind of not surprising that you would have radically different views. I think this is the beauty of Ken Stone's book, that he unpacks the multiplicity of views about non-human animals in the same way that he spent years unpacking the multiplicity of views around sexuality and gender that you can find in Hebrew Bible. So yeah, you can give me that example. I can also give you another example that counters it, and then we have to shrug our shoulders and say, all right, which one is toxic and troubling and bad, and we're colluding with the text when we don't pay attention, and which ones do we want to lift up and say, this is tikkun, this is healing, and this is what we need? Which is not to say you shouldn't name the stuff that you need to name. Yeah. It was a good comment. All right, who else? Whatever. However it gets to wherever it gets to. Name?
I'm Laura Grush. I've been a member of this class for at least 40 years.
I was going to say, I think you are one of the people who antedates me.
And I especially appreciate that you come after you've taught a whole year of other classes and been having your own synagogue. I wanted to recommend the program on PBS Nature, and last month they had a program about this perfectly natural, pristine desert, and everything was fine, and then they had a terrible drought, and in the end, there was so little water that the hippopotamuses and the alligators, did you see that? They didn't bite each other. they just were trying to survive, and they were packed together like sardines. It was such an astounding thing because I always think about the peaceable kingdom. I'm an artist, and I really like Edward Hicks's paintings about the peaceable kingdom because he put them down as images. But another part of that, the nature program, was the lions. And last week we were talking about should women bear arms. That's not the way you said it, but the lionesses were the big hunters for the pride and kept the pride alive.
Yeah.
So maybe you saw that. Maybe a lot of people saw that.
Since the 1980s, the extent and the amount of drought that has plagued the world has risen by 30%. We now have, I believe if I've got the statistic right, somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of our planet has experienced drought in the last few decades. That's an extraordinary amount of the planet to be burning up. Yeah.
And yet we still use pressure-treated water to water our lawns.
Yeah.
And flush our toilets.
Yeah, we do. And we use chemicals to keep lawns alive because, frankly, a lawn is about the most ecologically stupid creation human beings have.
Yeah.
Come over to my house, you'll see lots of flowers, vegetables in the backyard, and a ton of clover is everywhere. Because really, you know, who needs to be fed? Bees and insects.
Do we have, Mary, do we have ethical obligations to be vegetarians? I see that as a logical outflow of a lot of what you're saying.
It is, absolutely. And God basically set human beings up to be vegetarians for a good portion of the first part of, you know, the Genesis story, right? God doesn't permit human beings to eat meat until chapter 9. It's why I am one. Right, that became, for me, it was increasingly about this very question. Yeah. At the very, very least, human beings could start thinking about their consumption of meat, and particularly, you know, I almost put a picture on this PowerPoint of caged chickens, just so that you'd have to deal with the way in which dominion has led us to abuse, right? And I decided I had upset people enough last Sunday, I shouldn't be quite so. Give you the nice Rabbi Barbara for a week. Yeah. Yeah, any other comments?
Well, I want to thank you for challenging us and inspiring us and opening up our minds and hearts. Thank you, Rabbi Barbara. Can you talk a minute about what you're going to talk about next week?
I was just going to say, so next week we're going to enter the world of the real wild, right? The absolute wildest place in Hebrew Bible where non-human animals and divinity intersect are in the stories of the Leviathan and the Behemoth. Do you remember those creatures? Okay, I'm going to be introducing you to those creatures next week. They are wild, they're crazy. One of them, the Behemoth, we are not even sure what kind of creature that was. It's described in all sorts of wild ways. The Leviathan shows up in two completely oppositional ways, completely oppositional. And we are going to explore the question of whether the deity is more like these amazing creatures than the deity is like us humans. That ought to be interesting, right? Okay, I will see you next week then. Thank you. And once again, when you're on the way out, you might just go and thank James, right?